Hey there, my name's Tony. It's an early autumn day here in western Pennsylvania, and the last pawpaw fruits have just fallen off the trees. And you can see next to me, there are several small pawpaw trees that I've been growing, most of them from seed. But what exactly is a pawpaw tree? And why have most people never even heard of the fruit when it's the largest native edible fruit in North America? Well, let's find out. Now this tree next to me here is another pawpaw tree that I planted in the yard about a year and a half ago. And this is a named variety tree, so it's a grafted pawpaw tree. And you can see it's been losing a lot of leaves lately because it's autumn, and that's what deciduous trees do during autumn in colder climates. So let's talk about the names of this tree. The words pawpaw likely come from probably several hundred years ago, someone confusing the tree with a papaya tree. And I know in several countries people refer to papayas as pawpaws. So it causes a lot of confusion with that name, but there are other names you can call them. It's also called the Indiana banana, Hoosier banana, Kentucky banana, or poor man's banana. The scientific name of this tree is called Asimina triloba. Now the word Asimina likely comes from a Native American term for the tree called Asimin. And triloba refers to the fact that the flowers have a three-petal arrangement, like 3 inner petals and 3 outer petals. So that means these are in the genus Asimina, and there are about 7 other species in this genus, but all of the other species are mainly Florida-only plants native to the state of Florida and maybe parts of southern Georgia, in that area. But all of those other species are smaller shrub-like plants. So this one is known as the common pawpaw, and all those other ones have different names like big flower pawpaw and other things like that. Let's see, they come from a family of fruits known as the annona fruits. And the term for that family is something like Annonaceae or Annonaceae or something like that. But anyway, the other fruits in that family, you might be familiar with them if you live in tropical regions. So the most common ones are soursop, also known as guanabana, rollinia, custard apple. Probably the most popular is cherimoyas. Hey, I really like fruits, okay? All of those other fruits are from very tropical plants that live in, obviously more tropical climates, whereas the pawpaw is the only one in that family that lives solely in a temperate climate. So the tree itself is somewhat of a smaller sized tree. It's an understory tree, so you'll typically find it underneath much larger trees like oaks and maples and hickories. I typically see them between like 15 and 30 foot tall in the wild, but I mean the tallest I've seen is probably around 45 foot. And those are very large for a pawpaw. The trunks of these trees are fairly skinny. They don't have a very strong wood. They're a very flexible trunked tree though. And the trunks are they're fairly smooth, can sometimes be a bit bumpy, if it has a lot of notches and bumps on it. But it's fairly smooth and gray, and yeah, fairly skinny trunks. Grown in full sunlight, however, such as when they're planted in a yard, they take on a nicer, fuller shape. They aren't as tall and skinny trees then. They'll have the trunks are still kind of skinny, but the foliage will be much more fleshed out, and they tend to grow into a nice pyramid shape. So the leaves are typically a nice deep green color like this one, and during the fall they'll transition to a nice yellow color like these. Now the leaves are they're smooth edged. You can see they don't have any teeth or anything like that along the edge. They're very smooth. They're pretty long leaves. I think they tend to get between 6 and 12 inches in length. They're very big and tropical looking. In the wild, you'll see the bigger trees, the leaves will typically kind of hang downwards at the end of the branches. So that gives them a little bit of a unique look. And let's see, the shape of the leaf. They're fairly oval in shape, and they come to a point, but they typically tend to bulge out a bit more in between the middle and the tip of the leaf. So it's usually this area, in between the middle and the tip, where they're at their widest. So the leaves have a unique smell to them. They smell a lot like a green bell pepper, which I really don't like. So to me, it's kind of a bitter, nauseous smell. But if you were to, rub the leaves together and then smell them, it smells a lot like green bell pepper. Also, pawpaw leaves have an alternating arrangement on their branches. Now the leaf buds are typically a deep chocolate brown color, though they can get a bit grayish, especially in the winter. And these buds are very feathery looking. They look a bit like a feather, especially the ones at the tips of the branches tend to be much longer. Now the flowers of these trees are fairly unique and pretty looking. They're like a maroon or burgundy in color, and they droop downwards on the branches so they're facing towards the ground. And they have 3 inner petals and 3 outer petals. Now the flowers are, the trees don't self-pollinate, so you need 2 genetically different trees in order to get fruit. So if you just have one tree, you're not going to get any fruit from that if there aren't any other trees nearby. And the flowers can be either male or female on the tree, and the flower will transition from a female flower to a male flower. So it'll start female, then it'll develop pollen and become a male flower. And this can happen over a period of 1 to 2 days. Now the pollinators for these trees are not bees. Bees are what typically pollinate a lot of other deciduous fruit trees. But these trees are pollinated by flies and beetles. And to show this, the flowers have a somewhat yeasty or rotten smell to them, which you can't really smell it if you're far away from the plant. But if you stick your nose right up to the flower, you're going to be able to tell that it's a pretty rotten smell. And now flies and beetles aren't the best pollinators. They're not very efficient, not nearly as efficient as bees, so it can be hard to find very many fruits on wild trees. Although one thing you can do is hand pollinate. You can do this with a paintbrush or just using a male flower and brushing it against the female flower. Also, the flower buds are very spherical, they're round, and they are usually brown or gray in color, similar to the leaf buds, and they have a very fuzzy texture to them. And they start to develop during the mid to late summer in preparation for blooming the next year during the spring. And during that time in the spring, when they're starting to get ready to bloom and the weather is warming up, they'll swell up in size quite a bit in preparation to bloom. Now, pawpaw fruits are the real prize of these trees. The fruits are smooth and green, typically the same color as the leaves, so they can be kind of hard to spot on the trees. And the shape is similar to the shape of like a potato. They can vary quite a bit in size. The smallest I've seen was like the size of a large marble. And the largest wild ones I've seen were definitely over like half a pound. But the named variety trees can very frequently have several fruits on the tree that are larger than 1 pound each in weight. The fruits can grow singly on a branch or are more often in clusters. The clusters can vary between 1 and the most I've seen on wild trees was maybe 6 or 7, but they can get to be more than that in a cluster. I think I've seen a picture of some named variety trees where there were about 9 fruits in one cluster. You can see here this is a cluster of 2 fruits, a pair, and here's a cluster of 4 fruits. Now the fruits are, you can see they're fairly smooth and green, but they often have these black areas, black spots. Now this is just a cosmetic thing. It doesn't really affect the fruit at all, just the skin. And these are just areas where the fruits were bumped or scraped over time as they're ripening throughout the summer. Also, the fruits tend to ripen here in western Pennsylvania between mid-September and early October. So there's about a 3-week time period that you have to look for the fruits when they start to ripen. And you can tell that they're starting to get ripe by giving the fruits a squeeze on the tree. If the fruit has a little bit of give to it when you squeeze it between your thumb and your finger, then it's ripe enough to pick and should keep for a while in that state, especially if you refrigerate it. On the counter, they typically last only about 3 days, though I've seen some that aren't too ripe. You know, when I picked them, when they were just starting to give a little bit between my fingers, I've seen some of those last about 5 days on the counter, though they can last about 3 weeks in the refrigerator. Now, after the fruits start to have a little bit of give to them when you squeeze them, you only have about a day or two before those fruits will fall to the ground. And once they fall to the ground, animals will quickly find them. There are several animals out there in this region that love to eat these fruits, especially since they have a strong smell and can be easily detected. And once they fall to the ground, they start to get pretty soft and have a really nice smell to them, and will very quickly ripen from that point on. And they'll turn from a green to a yellow, brownish color, and eventually they'll turn kind of black and get to a full black with some even a little bluish tinge to them. But they're still good when they're black. Or they can be still good when they're black. A lot of people like them when they're black, since they have a more, a richer, sweeter taste to them. They're more of a, some people say they taste a bit kind of butterscotch-like or toffee-like in flavor at that point. So the big question is, what exactly do these fruits taste like? Well, that's a bit of a complicated question because pawpaw fruits vary quite a bit from tree to tree, and of course, taste is subjective. So it's gonna, a taste description of the fruit will vary from person to person. I'm going to try to do my best at describing it to you. So to me, a lot of the pawpaw fruits, or the general pawpaw flavor that I get from most fruits, is kind of like a mix between banana, melon, typically cantaloupe, and there's also a third flavor that I usually get. It's kind of a tropical flavor. Some people say it tastes like mango. It doesn't really taste like mango to me. To me, it's like kind of a tutti fruity type of flavor. If you've ever had a candy or a dessert that has a tutti fruity flavor to it, similar to bubblegum, it can also be like a bubblegum type of flavor. So if you combine banana, bubblegum, and cantaloupe together, that's what a pawpaw typically tastes like to me. Now, like I said, they vary quite a bit. So I've had pawpaws that taste almost exactly like a ripe banana. I've had some that taste very similar to a cantaloupe. And the best one I ever had at the Ohio Pawpaw Festival was a named variety that tasted very, very much like bubblegum. It was very strong in that tutti fruity bubblegum-like flavor. And I guess that flavor is somewhat similar to jackfruit. If you've ever tasted jackfruit, I've heard that it tastes quite a bit like bubblegum. Also, I've had one that, a couple that have had a bit of a Concord grape type of flavor to it. And those were very nice. Other flavors that certain varieties may have, or people have experienced with them, are vanilla, pineapple, sweet potato, cinnamon, apricot, or maybe even persimmon. Most of the wild fruits that I've tried have had at least some level of bitterness to them, so that is somewhat common with pawpaw fruits. Although most of those fruits have only been slightly bitter and only near the skin or the seeds. Though some of the fruits have been quite bitter, but most of them have been very tolerable. It's usually just a very minor bitterness, or just kind of a bitter aftertaste. Now the named varieties, most of them don't have any bitterness to the fruit whatsoever. So that's a good reason to buy a named variety tree if you're looking to get a pawpaw tree. Also, the named variety trees are very consistent in their flavor, whereas a wild tree, you really have no idea what you're going to get. You could get really good fruit from it, or you could get really terrible fruit that has a lot of bitterness, or even has a soapy taste to it. I've tried some of those, and they're not so great. Now, the fruits do sometimes have an aftertaste to them. With a lot of the wild fruits, there's typically a bit of a bitter aftertaste, but a lot of fruits have like either a banana or a cantaloupe aftertaste, or just a general melon aftertaste. Even a lot of the named varieties, some of them have like a banana aftertaste or a melon aftertaste, and those are fairly pleasing. It's the bitter aftertaste that you want to avoid. Also worth mentioning is that these fruits are fairly sweet. I don't think they have quite as high of a sugar content as a banana would, but they're fairly close to that. And they really don't have much tartness or acidity to them. The color of the pulp can vary anywhere from a pale yellow all the way to a bright orange color. The texture of the pulp is fairly smooth and not very fibrous, and it can vary anywhere from a pudding type of texture all the way to a firmer avocado type of texture. So the native range of pawpaw trees mostly occurs in the eastern United States. In the west, it ranges out just past the Mississippi River, to the east all the way to the east coast, the Atlantic coast, in the south all the way down to the northern edges of Florida. and in the north all the way up to the southern parts of Michigan and even into Ontario, Canada, around some of the Great Lakes. For habitat, these trees like to grow along the banks of rivers, large streams, possibly even lakes, and they like a soil that is moist, rich, well-draining, and somewhat sandy, though they can grow in harder soils. Like I said before, these are understory trees, which grow underneath much larger deciduous trees like maples, oaks, hickories, sycamore, beech. And because of that, they tend to be smaller trees, and the first year or two that they're growing, they can't handle very much sunlight, specifically UV wavelength light. So if you were to plant a small tree a year or two old in full sun, it would likely die because of this. But past 2 years, they can handle sunlight better, and when they're full grown, they do very well in full sunlight and will even fruit better in full sunlight. Now, if a larger tree in a pawpaw forest were to fall down, like a large oak or whatever, and a hole were to open up in the canopy of the forest, pawpaw trees can shoot up quite quickly. The taller trees can shoot up quite quickly in order to reach the sunlight and compete with the other trees. But the largest that I've read that they could possibly get is around 50 feet. Worth mentioning is the fact that these trees readily reproduce by creating root suckers, also called root shoots or root sprouts. Therefore, the trees can reproduce asexually by sprouting new trees from their roots. This method of reproduction means that not being able to produce fruit very efficiently, due to their pollinators being flies and beetles, isn't much of an issue for their population. As a result of this form of reproduction, small patches of trees found in the wild are oftentimes mostly genetically similar clones of each other, with an interconnected root system. This is referred to as a clonal colony. The most famous example of this is the clonal colony of 47,000 quaking aspen trees in Utah, that some claim to be the world's largest single organism. So the various animals that enjoy eating pawpaws include opossums, raccoons, foxes, deer, squirrels, insects, and of course humans. There's even a caterpillar that only feeds specifically on pawpaw leaves, and that's the caterpillar of the zebra swallowtail butterfly. So one of the biggest reasons that these fruits aren't very popular here in their native range in the United States is that they're very perishable fruits. So they don't store well, they don't ship well, so grocery stores are never going to have these. They're very soft, so you can't even stack these fruits. If you were to stack them like in a grocery store or shipping in cartons, they'd bruise very quickly because of how soft they are and how quickly they ripen, and they wouldn't last very long. In my experience though, pawpaw fruits do refrigerate fairly well if picked at the right time, before they have fallen and started to get yellow and brown. I have some in the fridge that I've from over 3 weeks ago that are still in fairly good shape and fairly green. And every so often I take a few out and let them ripen at room temperature for a few days, and they still taste really good. The fruits have been gaining in popularity, though, in recent years. There are several festivals dedicated to pawpaws across the country, the largest of which being in Ohio and North Carolina. I went to the Ohio Pawpaw Festival last year and had a really good time there. They had several wild variety and named variety fruits for you to sample and to buy. And there were several baked goods that you could purchase. Things such as pawpaw cookies, pawpaw bread, pawpaw jam, and there was also pawpaw ice cream and several different types of pawpaw beer, which was really interesting and quite good. You can do anything with pawpaws that you can with banana. So typical banana treats are like banana bread, smoothies, cookies, things like that. So one of the biggest names in the world of pawpaws is Neal Peterson. So this is a guy who, in the 80s and 90s, put together an experimental orchard of over 1,500 trees. And in order to improve on existing varieties, so all these trees had different genetic backgrounds that he kept track of. And eventually, after 20 years, he picked 6 of these varieties to release to the public. And they're much improved varieties, much bigger fruits than typical wild pawpaws, with some of these varieties having fruits over a pound. One of the biggest things is that they're much less seedy. Some of his least seedy varieties are 3 or 4% seed by weight. So that's fairly low. They're also much better, can be much better tasting varieties. There are some wild variety fruits, if you can find them, that are quite good though. But overall, his varieties that he developed are quite good and really helped improve the pawpaw industry and should help people learn to love and appreciate pawpaws more because of all his hard work. I actually have one of his trees that he developed right here next to me called Wabash. There's also a pawpaw breeding program at Kentucky State University, and they've done a lot of work to try to create more improved varieties and have released a couple varieties so far. I purchased a couple of those just this year. There's also a book that was written a couple of years ago entirely about pawpaws by an author called Andrew Moore, which I happen to have right here. And this is a fairly good book if you're interested in pawpaws. It contains a lot of information about the history of pawpaws, the author's experiences finding and looking for the fruits, and a good bit of information about all the different varieties available and where you can purchase them. A little bit about the history of pawpaws. The first fossil records of a pawpaw plant was dated back to between 56 and 34 million years ago in North America. So back then, it's likely that these fruits were eaten by the various megafauna that were around in that time, like things like giant ground sloths and woolly mammoths. Native Americans were known to enjoy pawpaws, and it's likely that they contributed to the expanding of these trees north and west from their initial native range when the Native Americans first started cultivating and eating them. Some historical figures who were known to enjoy pawpaws include George Washington, who it's said that his favorite dessert was chilled pawpaw, and it's also said that he planted them at his orchard in Mount Vernon. Also, Thomas Jefferson was known to have planted pawpaws at his orchard in Monticello. And the expedition of Lewis and Clark, it's recorded that in a journal, several journal entries from their expedition, that they enjoyed eating them on their way back home from out west to St. Louis. Now for nutrition, pawpaw fruits are fairly nutritious even for a fruit. I'll show you a table comparing the fruit to the fruits of apples, oranges, and bananas. Now this is based on 100 grams of fruit and is also based on percentage of daily value for the average human. So you can see they're fairly high in vitamin C, not as much as oranges, but higher than the other two fruits. And they're particularly high in minerals, very high in minerals actually, mostly with iron, magnesium, manganese, and copper. Now for medicinal uses, well, the tree has a chemical called acetogenins, and this chemical is mostly concentrated in the branches and the leaves. And this chemical gives the tree a pesticidal quality, so it makes the tree very resistant to a lot of insects and pest damage. So it's a great tree to use if you want to grow some fruit trees organically and never have to spray it. The tree is also very disease resistant as well. So acetogenins are being studied for use in the treatment of cancer. And they actually have the potential to be used to combat specifically drug-resistant cancer cells. So the way this works is that acetogenins, when consumed, reduce the ATP production of the mitochondria within cells, which starve the cells of energy. So they're, in a way, inhibiting cellular respiration. And because of the huge energy needs of rapidly multiplying and growing cancer cells within a tumor, the acetogenins tend to concentrate to those cells. Now, if you were to consume acetogenins without any cancer cells in your body, the acetogenins would spread throughout the cells in your body, and because of the overall ATP loss in production, your body would suffer a sedative effect. And this effect does occur to some extent, even when there are cancer cells. For other medicinal uses, the seeds have been used as an emetic and also as a treatment for lice in small children. They used to be ground up into a powder and sprinkled onto children's heads in order to get rid of lice, which makes sense since the tree has pesticidal qualities to it. And finally, the fruits can be used as a laxative, although you need to consume a significant amount of fruits in order to have this effect, which I wouldn't recommend eating too many fruits at once because of this. And I try to keep my eye on certain patches of wild pawpaws that I've found throughout the year so I can monitor the fruits and pick them when they're ripe, such as this patch of pawpaws behind me here, and these trees, and more pawpaw trees, and finally this tall patch of pawpaw trees with their leaves turning nice and yellow up on top. Now this is a pretty typical looking patch of wild pawpaw trees. You can see that their leaves are they're big and they're tropical looking, and they tend to droop downwards. You can see the very skinny trunks of these trees. As far as the habitat, you'll notice that they're growing just up the bank from a river. And they're growing amongst other larger hardwood trees. Mostly these ones this is a hickory. A lot of hickory in here. There's some oak, maple, sycamore, black cherry. You can see just how skinny these trunks are. This tree is about 15 foot tall, and give you a comparison with my hand. You can see my hand fits very easily around this trunk. They're very skinny, tall and skinny trees in the wild, because they have to compete with other larger trees in order to get enough sunlight. But this tree right here, you can see, has a nice pair of fruits on it. And these ones are just soft enough to pick. This tree here is massive for a pawpaw. You can see just how big the trunk is compared to my hand. I have fairly long fingers. This is a pretty thick trunk. You can see just how high up it goes. It's got to be at least 40 feet. So this is the biggest I've ever found. This is probably as big as they come for a pawpaw tree. Now just a little ways underneath this large pawpaw tree, you can see this whole area is just infested with this Japanese knotweed, which is a lot like bamboo. It's hollow inside, and you can see all the brown old stems on the ground. Just underneath this big tree, there's a couple really nice sized fruits that nothing has gotten to yet. There's a little bruise on it, but they feel like they're a very nice ripeness. Have a little bit of yellow to them, so they're pretty perfect. And they smell amazing. Definitely taking these. There's 5 in one on this cluster, and they're all pretty big. See if I can show you the other one. Yep, there's 5 of them. So here's a good example of some fruits that are more ripe. See, this one's still kind of green on this side, but it's kind of yellowish and turning brown on this side. And it's fairly soft. It's got some give to it. I can poke dimples in it. And this is at the stage that I prefer to eat them. Where they're nice and sweet, but they don't taste, really overripe or bitter or anything. But some people like them like this, when they start to get black and almost bluish. You can see it has like a tinge of blue on there. Some people like them even darker than this, when they're like fully black. You can see there's been animals or bugs eating at these. This one's a really good example of a pawpaw that's a really nice stage of ripeness. It's still kind of green, but also pretty yellow. Has a lot of browns in there. Even is a little bit bluish in places. Finally, I'd like to demonstrate the different ways to cut, serve, and eat pawpaw fruit. So here's the first fruit that I'm going to cut. And this is a fairly big fruit for a wild one. And you can tell it's pretty ripe. It's not overripe though. It's not even fully black yet. It's still a bit yellow and brown. But the way I'm going to cut up this one is probably the nicest way to present the fruit. That is by making a vertical cut all the way around the fruit, from the stem to the other end and back. So first of all, I'll take off the stem. And I'll just make a cut all the way around. And this way is probably the hardest way to cut open the fruit, at least with the wild fruits, because once you cut all the way around it, the way to open it is to kind of twist it open, and that can be kind of hard to do if the fruit has a lot of seeds in it, which the wild ones often do. It kind of makes the fruit stick together, so it doesn't always work very well twisting it. Like, twist one hand one way, the other way. But what you can do if it doesn't twist very easily is just kind of pry your knife into your cut, into the middle of the fruit, in between the seeds, in order to separate it a little bit in between the seeds. This one actually doesn't feel too seedy, so it should twist pretty easily. Yeah. Nice and clean twist on that one. Yeah, and this one actually isn't very seedy, so for a wild fruit. The named varieties can be as little as 3% seed by weight. this one, it smells really good. Then once you cut it open, you can just serve it and take out the seeds if you want, and then just kind of scoop it out with the spoon. You can see how soft it is. See how it has a custard-like consistency, or pudding-like. I'm going to taste this one. That one's pretty good. In a second here, I'll show you the seed. The seeds do have a bit of a casing on them. Just kind of a thin, pulpy covering to it. And here's what the cleaned off seed looks like. You can see they're pretty big. This one's actually not too big. They're kind of a, I don't know, lima bean or kidney shaped type of seed. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. So here's a smaller fruit, and the way that I'm going to cut this one is horizontally, and this is a nice way to serve it. If you just want to give everyone a small portion, you can actually cut it into slices if you cut it horizontally rather than vertically. There you go. Nice little slice of fruit. I'll taste this one as well. That one's pretty bad, actually. Not very flavorful. It has a lot of bitterness to it. Okay, so the last way to eat the fruit is the easiest way. And the way that I like to do it, especially when I'm out in the wild just picking them and eating them, is to just cut them in half like you did this one, horizontally. Then just squeeze it. As you squeeze it, the pulp just kind of comes out because it's so soft. Then you can just eat it up like that. And that's the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was informative and entertaining, and hopefully not too overwhelming. I know there was a lot of information in this one. If anyone has any questions that I left unanswered about pawpaw trees, pawpaw fruit, whatever, let me know in the comments below, and I'll answer them as soon as I notice them. And also, if anyone is interested in learning about how to grow pawpaw trees, I could do a short video specifically on that topic. Just let me know in the comments. Anyway, I'll see you next time. Today, I want to check out, no, that's not what I want to say. And they can often have, George Washington is claimed to have his favorite, further north and west of where they originally. For habitat, these trees like to grow along river, I can't say river. The acetogenins are going to spread to other cells as well as cancer cells. Now, if you were to take acetogenins, there you go. Nice yellow poop pulp. Lots of, I almost said poop.